So Madeleine Mindl Cohen is academic director at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, and also a visiting assistant professor of Jewish Studies at Mount Holyoke College. Before coming to the Yiddish Book Center, she worked as the editor-in-chief for an amazing Journal of Yiddish Studies called geveb, and also taught Yiddish language at Harvard University. Mindl can't join us in Berkeley today, but this is Mindl's old stomping grounds. She got her PhD at UC Berkeley in comparative literature, and her dissertation was titled "Here and Now: The Modernist Poetics of Doikayt" in 2016. I got to read a large chunk of the dissertation and found it super fascinating, and that's kind of how I ended up really wanting to invite Dr. Mindl Cohen to join us today. So thank you so much for gracing us, and I'll turn it over to you. I'll also just say one thing. We're sort of inviting more people into this seminar today. Welcome. I want to make sure that people who are enrolled in the seminar sort of get first crack at questions and things, but I think we probably will have time also to open it up more broadly. But first, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you so much. Yes, I wish so dearly that I was actually there in Berkeley with you all. I haven't been back for quite a long time, but so it was exciting. Nevertheless, the fact that it's on Zoom, it was really exciting to get this invitation, because I certainly, Naomi Seidman was professor at GTU when I was in grad school. So I was back and forth up the hill quite often as a grad student, and value very much what GTU is and does. So I'm really pleased to get to share some of my work with you all. I kind of wish I'd been sitting in on your entire semester, because 19th and 20th century is where I kind of live. So I would love to know more about what you've all been learning about. And I hope that you'll kind of make some connections between what I share today and your kind of bigger inquiries that you've been exploring this semester. So yeah, I thought I'll just say a word about how I came to this kind of the concept of Doikayt, why it became kind of central to my dissertation research. It's something I'm still writing about, Doikayt in Yiddish literature, to kind of bring us into the topic. So yeah, I studied comparative literature. I'm a scholar of literature. So my kind of entry point to this concept, though, as we'll hear today, it's really mostly associated with the political party of the Jewish Bund. So it's a political concept. But I came to it because one of the things that I have found really valuable about studying Yiddish literature is that the literature provides this kind of window to the world of Yiddish land, right? This kind of, in many ways, really lost culture of what Jewish life was like in Central and Eastern Europe up until the mid-20th centuries. And especially that kind of first half of the 20th century, which is a period of such great change and creativity and upheaval and modernization and redefinition of what national identity means kind of in the West writ large, and all of that applies to Jews. And literature is my way into understanding that world that we are so kind of profoundly separated from through the ruptures of the 20th century. And one of the kind of specific things was getting some kind of a sense of Jewish space through Yiddish literature, and space in this kind of expansive sense, right, of relationship to place, relationships with neighbors, this whole ecology of Jewish life that could be represented through what were really the kind of identifications that Yiddish-speaking Jews felt with cities like Minsk or the Shtetl of Belarus. And while I was in grad school, I actually got to spend a lot of time in those places. So I spent my summers as a teaching assistant on this really great travel program that took students from the US to Central and Eastern Europe to learn about the kind of history of Yiddish-speaking Jewish life there. So I spent every summer like reading the poetry of Moshe Kulbach in Minsk and Smorgon and Vilna, where he lived, or going to the hometowns of Kadya Molodovsky and Rachel Korn and like reading their poetry in a town where we often felt like it's quite possible nobody has read this poetry here or spoken Yiddish here for decades. You know, in some places there's Jewish life that continues, of course, and there are institutions and things, but in many places it was quite profound, right, to like bring Yiddish back into the spaces that it had come from. And so that became the thing that I wanted to explore, was that relationship between Yiddish literature and place. And so I learned about this concept of Doikayt from another Berkeley alum, Robbie Adler-Pekarar, who is also in comparative literature, and he's now in LA. He's been running the Yiddishkeit organization in LA that ran these summer programs that I worked on. So he introduced me to this idea of Doikayt and basically said, like, I'm pretty sure this is what you want to write your dissertation on based on the things you're interested in. So I took this term, which means literally Hereness, and we'll kind of flesh out what else it means, you know, today in class, as a way to describe the deep engagement that I was finding in Yiddish literature in the spaces that it came from. So the kind of investment and engagement of Yiddish literature in the local ecologies, I've started to think about it, and ecologies in a broad sense, right? Social ecologies, political ecologies, also geographic and kind of natural systems. But in order to kind of to use this term Doikayt to think about what was happening in Yiddish literature, I of course had to understand the history of the idea, which, as I said, is very much a political concept, right? And a kind of term to describe a movement of Yiddish cultural activism that's largely associated with the Jewish Labor Bund. And that was something that I was also interested in. That's part of my kind of Jewish family story, is, you know, Bundist organizing. So I was especially intrigued between this kind of connection between the history of Jewish socialist politics and this kind of realm of cultural activism in Yiddish literature, that there was this place that these two things came together. So the readings that I shared, and you know, much of what I'm going to talk about today, is hopefully to help us understand that context of the idea of Doikayt, that kind of political and cultural context, what it has to do specifically with the Yiddish language, why Yiddish is so important to this form of Jewish diasporic nationalist identity, or the idea of national cultural autonomy. Those are all things I'll come back to, which were so influential in Jewish politics, you know, just over a century ago, or 125 years ago is really the period that we're talking about. And it's a kind of cluster of ideas that I think still is one of the reasons people come to the study of Yiddish today. So it's quite resonant in those ways. And I don't know if it's like reassuring or the opposite of reassuring to know that, you know, so many of our kind of contemporary debates and struggles around the politics of Israel, of Zionism, ideas about Jewish belonging or Jewish identity in diaspora, and our attempts to kind of understand the persistence of anti-Semitism, so many of these things have kind of parallels and prehistories and origins in this period about 125 years ago. And perhaps in your class, you've been discovering, you know, many much earlier kind of parallels and prehistories as well. But for me, it's quite important to understand this historical period, really the kind of rise of nationalist identity and nationalist thought, and the spectrum of ways that this is reflected in Jewish politics from Eastern Europe and in the politics of Yiddish-speaking Jews. So I'm going to share. I just have a few kind of very basic slides to help guide us through. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, the kind of key figures or concepts that I'm talking through First is the Jewish Labor Bund, in Yiddish, der Allgemeine Jiddische Arbeiterbund. And I just noted here, the readings that I shared that related to the history of the Bund. So we'll talk a little bit about these kind of documentary pieces, these excerpts from the Bundist congresses and conferences as they were debating the national question. You had an essay by Vladimir Medem, The Worldwide Jewish Nation, excerpts from this essay by Levi Kodis called Facing the Future, and the short talk by Joshua Myers about the history of the Bund. So I'll talk a bit more about the Bund first, and kind of segue from that into especially the idea of national cultural autonomy, which in many ways kind of can equal the term Doikayt. You can think of Doikayt as the kind of like Yiddish, the term arising from Yiddish, but then in many ways is used to describe what national cultural autonomy would mean for Yiddish-speaking Jews. But we'll talk a bit more about that, why the Yiddish language itself is so important to this, why language is so important to the idea of national cultural autonomy, and then this term Doikayt. And I thought this would be helpful too. This is just kind of a timeline of these documents. So I realized it's very neatly a 50-year period from 1897, which was both the founding year of the Bund and also the year in which the first Zionist Congress was held. And that's the kind of anniversary that Levi Kodes's essay is marking. So I didn't give you much of this, but basically he's writing an essay reflecting on the legacies of the Bund and the Zionist movements on their shared 50-year anniversary. So those two dates kind of bookend the material that we're talking about. The excerpts of the decisions from the Bund that you read were from 1899, 1901, 1905, and 1910. The essay by Vladimir Medem was from 1911. This poem by Avram Raisin that I hope we'll have some time to read and discuss is from 1917. So that's kind of the timeline that we're walking through. Okay, so I'm going to leave this here for a second while I talk a bit about the Bund. And there are a lot of resources for learning more about the history of the Bund. So I'm going to try to be very brief and really just focus on how do we get to the idea of Doikayt? Why is it associated with the Bund? But just to give the briefest background, the Bund begins as small illegal underground assemblies of Jewish workers called circles, basically in Russian, that are being organized in Tsarist Russia in the Pale of Settlement. Basically, they are small illegal workers' unions and educational circles that are aiming to educate Jewish workers, or in the kind of Marxist lingo, to raise the class consciousness of Jewish workers. So these are organized by Jews, but really by fairly assimilated Russian-speaking kind of intelligentsia, members of, Jewish members of the intelligentsia. So their educational mission is really Jewish workers need to learn Russian in order to join the broader kind of Russian socialist movement. So they start out as educational circles with that goal. And they've recognized that there's a need to organize among Jewish workers because there really is a large class of Jewish factory workers in the Pale of Settlement that are kind of ignored by Russian socialists, right? Like the divisions between Jews and Russians are strong enough that Russian socialists can't or won't organize Jews, or Jews won't be organized by Russians. And there's still quite a widespread idea that Jews just really aren't the proletariat, right? They are a kind of a parasitical class, even though the evidence that they are working in factories in places like Lodz should be unavoidable. So Jewish socialists start to organize them, but it's really a very kind of utilitarian approach, right? They are not organizing Jews as Jews. They are organizing them as workers who will hopefully join, the broader Russian socialist movement, but they're the only ones who can do it. And that really extends to the language politics, right? So we start to already see the kind of language dynamics, the attitudes towards Yiddish that are really going to change over this period. So at this point, these initial organizers of the Bund don't speak Yiddish themselves, and their goal is to teach Russian to Jewish workers. They realize fairly quickly that in order to do that, they probably need to know Yiddish themselves first. They can't, they need a kind of language of communication. And kind of very quickly, a second generation of Bundesleaders develops who are from this actual Yiddish-speaking Jewish working class. So they are Yiddish speakers. But for example, Vladimir Medem, whose essay you read, he actually was raised Christian. His parents had converted to Christianity, which was, somewhat common in the Russian Empire as a way to advance oneself. So he certainly did not grow up speaking Yiddish. He grew up speaking Russian, and he had to learn Yiddish as an adult. So the attitude toward Yiddish is also completely utilitarian, just practical, based out of practical necessity at that point. You have to use the language that the people you're organizing speak. Because there really was such a significant kind of industrial Jewish working class, though, the Bund grows very quickly. So it was a founding member of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, the RSDWP, which was founded in 1898. So just 1 year after the Bund was kind of officially founded. But even in that brief period of time, the Bund had organized more quickly and was better resourced than the other founding members of the Russian Socialist Party. So the founding meeting of the RSDWP happens in the Bund's office in Minsk, because they're the ones who've actually been collecting dues and have an office. So that's one of my go-to fun facts. Did you know that actually it was the Jewish Socialist Party where, the Russian socialist movement had its start? So those excerpts that you read, the decisions on the nationality question, show us the development of these attitudes toward Yiddish and the kind of rapidly changing stance of the Bund toward the idea of being a Jewish socialist party, right? So not just being a socialist party working among Jews, but being a Jewish socialist party, organizing Jews as Jews, not only out of necessity, which specifically means that you're not only advocating for their individual or civic rights, but that you are advocating for collective, group, or national rights. And yeah, there are a lot of reasons for that that development that happens in this period from 1899 to 1910, and that's one of the things I'm happy to discuss, especially based on your questions. But the general context, right, is it's not anything specific to Jews. It's part of this much broader kind of context of socialism and identity in Europe in this period, right? So nationalism has been growing, has become like the defining organizing feature of life in Europe throughout the 19th century. And I'm sure you've encountered this in your discussions about Jewish liberalism, right? Like the Jews are wrestling with, are we a nation? Because everybody is starting to define themselves as nations around them. The things that are specific to Jewish situation is there has been a real rise in anti-Semitic violence in the Russian Empire and in the Pale of Settlement since the 1880s. So since the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, there are waves of pogroms and Jews are punished as revolutionaries, basically. This very much continues in the 1905 revolutionary period, where there are essentially state-sanctioned pogroms as punishment for the revolution. And that continues absolutely through the 1917 revolution and during World War I. So this is something that then, the Bund, but basically every Jewish party has to acknowledge and wrestle with, right? That the Jewish workers that they are trying to organize are not suffering only as workers or only as the proletariat, they are suffering as Jews, right? They're facing persecution as Jews. So this is something that the Bund needs to address in the work that it's doing. And we don't really have time to get into it. I think Josh Myers mentioned it in his talk, but there's a whole history of self-defense organizing that is a really important piece of the work that the Bund and many of the Zionist parties, many Jewish parties of the time are either engaging with or debating the necessity of. So the other, still kind of thinking about this broader turn toward national cultural rights that we see the Bund embracing. The Jews are not the only minority group or the only national minority group in the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, these two places where socialism is rising. There are many different national minority groups in these places, and the socialists in both empires are trying to determine what's their policy toward national minorities, right? Does everybody have to become Russian or German in Austro-Hungary? Or are there going to be rights for all of these various collectives that in some ways see them, have been under imperial control? And if we're going to motivate them for revolution, we need to address their kind of collective needs as well. So the idea for national cultural autonomy that the Bund starts to articulate in these statements really comes from Austrian socialists who are not Jewish. They're thinking about what to do about all the various nations that have constituted Austro-Hungary and what's their program for them. And there's a whole debate among the Austrian socialists about whether the Jews count as a nation or not. So it's one of those ironies, right? That this idea, the kind of proponents of this deal, Otto Bauer, for example, some of whom have Jewish backgrounds, who come up with this concept of national cultural autonomy, say, by the way, we don't think Jews count. But yet still, this concept does get embraced and adapted by many Jewish thinkers who think, I think Jews do count. The big kind of sticking point is territory, right? Or how do we define nation? And the two kind of easiest answers are territory and language. So those who think that territory defines a nation say Jews aren't a nation. They have no territory here in Europe. The only territory that they have claim to is Israel-Palestine. That's where we get the whole kind of grouping of Jewish territorialist movements. Other people say national groups are also defined by language. That's one of the kind of easy ways to tell who's who and what you are, is what language you speak. So this gives us a kind of easy, kind of foundational divide, which Simon Rabinovich writes about in the essay that I shared with you also, between territorialists and autonomous. So territorialists being a kind of broad grouping for most Zionist groups, right? There are some Zionist groups that are cultural Zionists. They're not really that kind of focused on the idea of territory. It's more the kind of concept, and they are happy for a Jewish state to remain a kind of utopian goal. But essentially, the idea of creating a Jewish state is one of the kind of defining features for Zionist movements, some Yiddishist movements as well, right? Some territorialists would be happy for Birobidzhan or part of Madagascar or something like this, right? The territory might be anywhere. They're kind of open to these things. And the autonomous are ones who say, it's not about territory. We want to remain a national minority here in the places we've lived, and we are defined as a nation by our culture. And the kind of easiest thing to point to, what is national culture, is language. So just kind of taking a step back, I think it's important to remember, what are all these debates about? The core is this whole spectrum of Jewish movements, including the Bund and the Zionist movements, are looking to improve Jewish life, right? All of these different philosophies and ideologies have at their core trying to solve what is still thought of as the Jewish question in Europe. What are we going to do with the Jews in Europe? So the Bund has begun by focusing on socialist answers to this question, improving the quality of life for Jews based on improving their economic and social rights. But it becomes also then improving their life as Jews collectively. So their life as Jews also, which means they start to adopt this idea that they have also cultural rights, autonomous rights, and the core to this is being able to use their language in all facets of their life. So, okay, I don't think I will talk through those decisions, but that's something we can come back to if people are interested in the kind of specifics of the changing ideas there. But I will just note that language is mentioned in the very first one, right? It's part of the original kind of example raised by John Mill, saying, like, for example, we can see that the Poles in Germany do not have full rights because they can't actually use the Polish language in their right of assembly. So their right of assembly doesn't mean anything if they can't use their language. So language is his initial example for what national cultural rights mean and why they're important. And by the 1910 statement, they're enumerating specific language rights that they want access to, including the right to run schools in Yiddish. So language is really the one thing that's named and described in terms of what these national cultural rights will mean that they would be fighting for. Good. So then, yeah, just to say a word about Vladimir Medem and this essay, The Worldwide Jewish Nation. So Medem is a good example, I think, of the kind of core tension that we see the Bund navigating in those decisions. And that's the tension between their values as a Marxist party to be internationalist, to be opposed to nationalism, and this kind of growing need to support Jewish national rights. So we see that being kind of argued about in those various decisions. Is there a way to protect Jewish national rights without crossing some line into advocating for nationalism? And I like the line in all of those decisions that say the danger is it could lead to chauvinism. So this becomes like a running line in my head of, like, if you're weighing whether something is good to do or not, you should consider, could it lead to chauvinism before you make your decision? So Medem is one of the kind of leading thinkers of the Bund who becomes associated with trying to answer this question of what should be the Bund's attitude toward the national question. And he's really associated with the idea of neutralism that is kind of seen to define the Bund's attitude, which is basically, as it sounds, not to weigh in either way. And we see that in most of those intermediary decisions. They agree that the Jews are a nation. They agree that all nations should have the right to cultural autonomy, but they don't really think it should be a priority because it could lead to nationalist thinking among the working class. It could blur their class consciousness, is the other phrase that they use. And yeah, so this essay, I thought, is a good example, right, of somebody who's kind of trying to step outside of the debate of whether Jews are a nation or not by saying they're not a worldwide nation, but sure, maybe in each different state, you could consider that grouping of Jews as a nationality. So he says yes and no still, right? He says, you can't say that all Jews are one nation because there's no common denominator by which we could define them as such. And yet, in each different state, in Russia, in Poland, we can and should advocate for their cultural rights. And again, by that, he really means Yiddish, that we should be supporting the development of Yiddish, the right to have schools in Yiddish, the right for workers to use Yiddish at any point in their lives. So he gives us, this is one of the ways that he demonstrates that Jews around the world could not possibly be seen as a nation because there's no one language that would unite them. You know, Jews in France and Germany are still Ashkenazi, and yet they have not spoken Yiddish for generations. So how could they possibly be a part of the same nation as the Russian Jews? Or worse, if you're a socialist, the only language that would unite them is Hebrew. And clearly that's not something that the socialist parties are going to get behind. They have an anti-religious program as well. It's not a living language. This is also a kind of key problem. So it's part of the historical legacy. You know, it points to those moments when perhaps Jews were one nation, but the fact that it's no longer the spoken vernacular will only unite Jews in a kind of looking backward to a past and not to the current moment. And yeah, again, I'm not gonna, I could say so much about Yiddish itself. I haven't kind of worked in time for that here, but I'd be so happy to answer any questions or say anything more about the kind of status of Yiddish if people want to ask about that. But, you know, to get to our kind of key term, you will have noticed that the word Doikayt has not come up in any of these sources thus far, right? So the kind of first time we encounter it in that timeline of materials is only in Simon Rabinovich's introduction to Vladimir Medem's essay. So Simon Rabinovich writes, you know, that Medem became a proponent of Doikayt, meaning Hereness, drawing a clear distinction between the Jewish socialists who sought to improve the life of Jews in Poland and elsewhere, here and now, and the supposedly utopian program of the Zionists. So Rabinovich, the contemporary historian, tells us that Medem was a kind of early advocate of Doikayt, but it's not, there's no citation, right? There's no suggestion that Medem was using the word Doikayt. And I have not found an example that he did. Also, we remember he was largely writing in Russian. So, you know, whatever, there are different terms. I think the term he really uses is translated into English as localism. And that's probably kind of the closest parallel to Doikayt, but none of the Yiddish versions of his published work, and his work was all, you know, translated into Yiddish, use that term Doikayt. So the reason that you have this excerpt from this essay by Levi Kodes from 1947 is that is still the earliest example that I've been able to find of a Bundist using the word Doikayt to describe the Bund's program, and of anybody using it in that time period to describe this kind of cultural or political idea. So I'm still quite sure that there must be earlier uses of this term that are just difficult to locate yet, right? Like he uses it in a way that suggests it is a familiar word in 1947. So we can assume from that that it's a term that's been in use for some period beforehand, but not that I've been able to find. And that is, it's a search that I, like every couple of years, I do it again because the digital archives are improving very dramatically, and the ability to search Yiddish full text is improving kind of year by year. So like I will run this search again probably right after doing this talk, because every time I talk about this, I get nervous that like, oh, maybe some new source will have surfaced right now. But to this point, this is what I found. So let me switch over to how Levi Kodes uses this word. The Bund has always fought for continuity, for creative national life, for Doikayt, for the right to remain rooted in the ground where the Jewish masses live and fight. So that's his definition of Doikayt. And the conclusion that I draw from this, the fact that it's only in 1947 that we find a Bundist using the term, though he is using it to describe the work that the Bund had been doing, especially in Poland in the interwar period, it's really in this moment, this incredibly intense, kind of unimaginable moment at the end of World War II, when all Jewish political parties are debating what now, right? Where to rebuild, where do the Shir Sapleitim go, right? Like where do we resettle all of these thousands, tens of thousands of people who are basically in DP camps still, or their lives have been interrupted. And this is an incredibly intense moment of debate between various Zionist movements who are saying, come to Palestine, between Jewish aid organizations that are trying to get people to the United States or to Australia or to various other Jewish communities, and groups like the Bund that are saying, no, come back and rebuild, that see that it's an incredibly important part of their kind of continued political agenda, that abandoning Jewish life in Europe, as Hodes puts it, is furthering the victory of the Nazis. It seems the Nazis have been defeated, but if Jewish life in Europe doesn't continue, they have won some important victory. And he puts that in kind of even starker terms than in the sections that I've given you. So it seems to me it's in that moment, in 46 and 47 and 48, that actually both Bundists and Zionists start to use the shorthand of do, here, and dort. And I did also find Zionist citations of the term Doikayt when they're talking about their argument with Bundists. So there is use of the term both by Bundists and Zionists, but only in this moment. And then it's actually quite fascinating, right, to see that Zionists are adopting a usage in which they are dort, they are there. They're saying that Eretz Yisrael is there. You would assume that they would want to say, no, we're the here, but it is this little bit of a flipping, right, of that kind of long traditional idea of Eretz and Golis, right, that Golis is the there, and that Eretz Yisrael would be here. So that's the kind of moment that we find Doikayt becoming the shorthand for the Bundist positions. Okay, and so last but not least, this is kind of moving back in time just to, we don't have an example, or I haven't yet found an example of the term Doikayt being used in that kind of pre-war period, but as an example of the fact that we do certainly see it kind of throughout the work that parties like the Bund were doing, and in the Yiddish literature and culture of the time, which is what I really study, I shared with you this poem by Avram Rezen, who is really he's a prominent Yiddish writer. He's really an activist in this kind of movement to establish modern Yiddish culture. So I picked this picture because it shows Rezen here on the left with his fabulous mustache in the company of other great Yiddish cultural figures of the time. So all of whom have fabulous mustaches. So here's Yud Lamed Peretz, right, who's a well-known author, I imagine you know. Sholem Ash, the author of God of Vengeance here, and of the novels The Nazarene, right? Chaim Zhidlovsky, who came up, I think, in the Rabinovich essay and in the Medem essay. So he's another kind of important cultural theorist of Yiddishism. And Hersh David Nomberg, who's another Yiddish writer of the time. So we see this is this kind of, we talk about them as Yiddish writers, but I think better to think of them as cultural activists, right? Like these are people who are advocating for the idea of modern Yiddish culture. And Avram Rezen is very much a part of that movement. One other thing I'll note is he came to New York in 1911. So this poem that I shared was published in 1917. I think it was probably written before that. I don't know how long, but it's quite possible that this is a poem he wrote about his hometown after emigrating to the United States, so after leaving his hometown. And that adds a different dimension, I think, to how we understand the kind of like bombastic love for home and like propagandistic identification of home that we read in this poem. So yeah, I don't know that it's a great work of poetry, but it certainly, I think, is a really good, I've always found it to be a really good demonstration of this idea of like local identity in Yiddish culture. And, you know, already in 1915 or so, he is writing it and framing it as a response to what we assume is Zionist thought, right? So he says, an Entfel zu die Sucher a Heim für Jiden, a response to the seekers of a home for Jews. So those who believe Jews do not yet have a home and are working to create one. This is Raisin's response to that. So I thought I will just read this for you in Yiddish, and then I will stop talking and we can open it up to discussion, and we can go back to any and all of the things that you're interested in. But it's always good to hear some Yiddish in a talk about Yiddish. So, mein Heim. Ich bin a städteldicker Jid, und ich schäme nicht zu sagen. Und ich kann es nicht vertragen, wenn sie sagen mir als nicht. Dort hab ich verbracht viel Jahr in a säuber kleinem Stiebel. Ich wär beis und hab verriebel, wenn ihr ruft es Golles Gor. Ich hab lieb mein alter Heim, und ich sog es euch ausdrücklich, als gespielt hab ich sich glücklich bei die Prisbelech von Leim. Milch und Honig, ja, gewiss. Alles ist in der Heim gewesen, nicht in Chumisch bloß gelesen. Milch und Honig, ach, wie süß. Ohne Land bin ich, nicht wahr? Das wollt doch gewinn a Busche. Unser Stiebel ist bei Jerusche von ein alter Seidengor. In mein Städtel die Schul hält und steunt und bleibt verwundert. Steht schon Jahren 700 und mit Kedusche ist voll. Und Traditie sucht ihr? Nein. Es ist ein ausgetrachte Meise. Freitag esst man Bulkes Weiße, Schabes esst man Fisch mit Chrein. Okay, so I will stop there, and I will stop this so that I can see you all better. And yes, I'm very happy to hear your thoughts and answer questions about Yiddish language, about the Bund, about Doikayt, about any of the readings in particular. Yeah.
So much. All right, where's open for?
Just a clarifying question. How
Maybe
does,
I'll just say your
oh,
name.
hi, I'm
Yeah.
Marcy. Thank you for your amazing lecture. How does the workman's circle, this in the United States,
Yeah.
relate to the Bund? It certainly was in the background of my family, and I don't know how they relate.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big topic, but you know, in a lot of ways, there's kind of shared DNA between the workers' circle or the workman's circle and the Bund, right? And it's a good reminder that even in Europe, right, the Bund is one of a number of socialist tendencies. It's by far the largest, but it doesn't have a monopoly on being the only Jewish socialist party. So Workers' Circle is likely founded by Jewish socialists, some of whom may have been Bundists, some of whom may not. There's a great history of the Bund post-war that gets at some of like, the Bund never really took off in the US. And it's kind of interesting that it didn't, because in many other places of Jewish diaspora from Eastern Europe, it did, right? So there's a real, like the Bund in Australia is still there. So why did the Bund, you know, remain the kind of major Jewish socialist party in Australia or in Argentina, but not in the US? I don't remember all of the reasons for it, but basically it's that there's like, some of it is, I think there are pre-existing more like German Jewish socialist organizations that are already in place in the US, so that by the time Eastern European Jews are coming, there isn't quite room to like completely constitute a new movement. They have to work within some of the existing traditions. But I think also, yeah, that Jewish socialists from Eastern Europe come to the US and they do want to create new institutions and organizations that suit the different kind of context of the United States. So I think there are many Bundes who become members of the Workers' Circle and are probably involved in all of its organizing. And sometimes it's like they've tried to establish a Bund chapter and it doesn't work and they end up shifting into this other thing. But I think if I'm remembering right, I think the place to read about this is in David Slucky's Bund about the Bund post-war, but I think he gets into the earlier history of the United States. But yeah, it is quite an interesting topic of why Workmen's Circle kind of became the biggest Yiddish affiliated socialist movement in the US and not some descendant of the Bund.
We'll be getting into that very article next week in our unit.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so from what I know about Yiddish, it's a combination of a bunch of different languages. And that it was different in a lot of different places, like there's different dialects. So when they were coming together to form like, oh, we're all gonna unify around Yiddish, how were they dealing with all the differences in Yiddish and it's similar to the languages in the places that they were speaking?
Yeah, excellent question. And yeah, absolutely right. So, Yiddish is foundationally a Germanic language. It descends from kind of medieval German dialects with important components of Hebrew and Aramaic, and it is almost always written in the Hebrew alphabet. So that's kind of the core component going back to the medieval period. And then, as Jews move from Germany to Slavic-speaking territories, they start also kind of really incorporating Slavic languages. So those are kind of the key things in the mix. But it's also absolutely correct that the dialects of Yiddish are quite pronounced in large part because, right, there's never a state to centralize the language, right? So if you don't have a capital and you don't have institutions, who's going to determine what's proper Yiddish? So one of the, a really defining feature of Yiddish in the 20th century that still very much is in the DNA of how one studies Yiddish today is part of these kind of Yiddish national movements, this national cultural autonomy movement at the turn of the 20th century are Yiddish-speaking Jews who say, we need to standardize Yiddish because other real national languages are standardized and they have set agreed upon grammars and dictionaries and things. So it's an example of how Yiddish cultural activists really are kind of operating from within these models of national identity that they're learning from Germans and Poles and Russians around them. So essentially the organization YIVO, which you might have heard of, which still exists in New York, they're a scientific organization. One of their projects is to establish a kind of standardized orthography, and they establish a lot of the educational projects to teach Yiddish and study Yiddish. They establish a standardized Yiddish. It's called Klalsprach, which is like klal from Hebrew. So it's like the rule-based language. So none of this kind of haphazard, say whatever you want. They set a number of standards. It isn't exactly any real Yiddish dialect. It is kind of a composite, mostly of Lithuanian Yiddish, which is where they were based, but it includes some kind of components of like Polish Yiddish. So they make a kind of artificial language that like wouldn't have been the natural dialect of any people. That's funny. And that's the language that everybody who has studied Yiddish in a college class since the 1940s in New York learns. So we all speak this to a slight degree, artificial language. So it's another thing actually that Yiddish and modern Hebrew share, right? They are both the kind of languages that are products of national movements. I forget if there was a second part of your question that I was going to try and get to, or if that mostly answered it. I guess I would say most of the dialects are mutually intelligible. And it's one of the things we kind of say about Yiddish speakers is there tends to be a kind of high level of component consciousness, we say, meaning that Yiddish speakers can be aware of like, oh, I'm using more German, or I'm using more Hebrew, or I'm using more Polish right now. So there's a sense that Yiddish speakers, you know, if you're traveling or you meet somebody from far away and their Yiddish is different from yours, you might be slightly better at kind of learning to communicate and finding the kind of common denominator of your Yiddish than we assume speakers of some other languages are. So that's already kind of built into Yiddish speaking life, the kind of speaking across dialect difference. And there are, you know, speakers do kind of adopt more and more standardized use of language as the 20th century goes on, not just because Yivo said so, but more because, you know, if you're as publishing and as radio and all of these kind of modern modes of communication have taken over, standardized modes that are more easily and widely understood become useful and necessary.
I'll hop in with the question. This is so fascinating. Thank you, Mindl. So I feel like when I hear like the language of Doikayt these days, you know, in 21st century Bay Area, like it's often in this sort of overtly diasporist sort of ideological context of sort of wherever you are, wherever we are, like that's our place. But something that was striking to me in these readings and in your talk is this question that arises for me of like, to what extent is this a Polish or like a Russian thing, you know? And even in this poem, Mein Heim, where Reisen, you know, references, I mean, as you were saying, which I think is so interesting, the possibility that he wrote this from New York, but he's still like so nostalgically committed to this place. And he even emphasizes like, you know, listen well and be astounded. My shul stood there for 700 years. And Rabinovich also like makes reference to this fact that, you know, we're talking about people where there was Jewish continuity in this place, you know, on this plot of the earth for like 600 years, 700 years. To what extent do we like have to understand this as really locally based in this particular place, or to what extent were they thinking about it in more sort of universal diasporist terms?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it probably is to some degree a kind of open question. So I think in the sense of like, both things are probably true, and especially depending on period. So I think it's quite right that in this, in the Russian Empire and then in Poland in the interwar period, what the Bund is really concerned about is continuing Jewish life there where they've been, and kind of asserting that this is the home of the Jewish community. So their concern is less when they say wherever we are, that is where we live, they really mean, and here is where we are, right? We're talking about the cities of Poland or the cities of the Pale. So I think that's probably right in both of those periods, that's really what they're focused on. And it's another thing I've kind of come to realize how much it is important to acknowledge this kind of in the frameworks of nationalism, really, right? To like not romanticize that. You'll see real kind of blinders amongst Yiddishists about the fact that Yiddish is not the language of all Jews, right? Like they really are ignoring, they're ignoring lots of different areas and groups by saying that. So there is some kind of a focus, I think, on their situation in those periods. The important changes are probably, especially after the war. So actually in this moment where we know they are using the word.
Dylan, can you please mute? How do I do that? Sorry, Mindl.
That's okay.
And then just.
There we go. Oh, sorry.
You can put them in a way so you can.
Okay, yeah, no, we're good. Okay, sorry, go for it.
Okay. That especially in that post-war period, you know, when we actually know they're using the word Doikayt, it's also a moment of dispersion, right? So it really, you know, the decreased Jewish communities of Europe are kind of in limbo either, right? Like they're still displaced, or they have left for the US and for Israel, Palestine, and for Central and South America. You know, those communities all grow from the communities of survivors. And in those places then, and David Slucky's book is really about this, right? Like, what do they do with their Bundes ideas in that new situation? So probably we can also see that moment being the kind of rewriting of like, okay, now we mean here too, right? Now we mean everywhere. And he's also writing about their attempts to maintain a worldwide Bund or to establish a worldwide Bund, which now is necessary in a way that they didn't feel it necessary when Poland and Russia were these real kind of centralized spaces of Jewish life. So it would make a lot of sense to me, right, that it's both in that moment they're adopting this term Doikayt to describe this thing they've been doing, and they probably are redefining it at that point to speak to this kind of broader dispersion and the attempts to build, you know, Yiddish cultural life in these new places. So maybe from that moment, it starts to take on more of those kind of diasporist associations that we still see it resonating with today.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, because I mean, at least as of 3:15 today, Pacific Standard Time, like the first instance that you've seen is precisely this, like,
Yeah.
where it's really located in Europe in this particular region to the point of saying, like, let's stay here. I just found that really interesting.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up on that question. Hello, I'm Natalie. Thank you so much for your talk. Again, my context here, just hearing this word in the air, it often almost seems like there's a spiritual dimension or like a way of thinking about diaspora in a way that is, yes, spiritually meaningful in some way, which seems pretty different than this like staunchly socialist,
Yeah.
we have rejected religion, opiate of the masses kind of origins that the Bund seems to be offering. And so I'm curious if you have any, do I misunderstand how people are using this term, first of all, or if you think that it is kind of spiritualized today, like how did we get here?
Right. Yeah, my sense is that you're right, that there probably is more of that for people who today who might identify as Jewish and for whom the word Doikayt means something and like being a diasporist means something. And there is also a spiritual component to that identity. Like I know those folks too, so I agree that that is real, it exists. So right, how do we get there? I mean, I think partly it is quite a separate kind of conversation about the relationship to religion and spirituality in leftist and socialist spaces today that in many ways I think is quite different from the early 20th century movement. So that's interesting and probably has more to do with people today than it has to do with that period. And that would be quite interesting to explore more. I don't know much about this, right? But I know like this has been at some of the tensions about like what is Jewish currents right now? What's the kind of, you know, those are some of the debates around that magazine currently and the old guard who think religion has no place in it. So yes, I had a second half of a thought in response to, oh, right. The second half of the thought is I think the Simon Rabinovich article gets at this to some degree. And there is more about this. The degree to which there is still an idea of messianism really kind of as an undercurrent to Jewish socialist and leftist thought of the early 20th century, right? So he has a section where he talks about the idea of messianism as being kind of foundational to Jewish identity at that point, and how we can see the promise of revolution kind of stepping into the space of the promise of redemption or of the coming of Messiah. So I think there is room to explore something there, right? And people have thought about this of like one of the ways that like socialism is spoken about or becomes Jewish socialism is in needing to kind of suggest like, here is the new promise of a world to come that socialism offers that is different from what tradition has offered. So that might be the place that there is, like, despite the overt and stated secularism, that there is still some kind of relationship with the idea of messianism.
You're talking about in this phase where it becomes a Jewish project specifically, and what it means to become a Jewish project is gonna have to engage with Jewish religiosity in some way.
I think so, yeah, and I think that Simon Rabinovich is saying that to some degree, yes, that if it's still going to be Jewish in some way, right? Like if you're still building something that's called a Jewish national culture, there has to be some answer to one of these kind of defining features of what it is to be a Jew, which is to wait for Messiah. So what are we waiting for now, if not Messiah?
Sorry.
Okay, I just, so the only people I know who are really speaking Yiddish a lot are the Hasidism. So this idea of religion and Yiddish, I don't know, I mean, I know nothing about it, but to me, it's like, well, okay, if this lot are the only group who are using the language and they are technically very observant, how does that work with all these other people who are saying, well, wait a minute, no, this is something, and
Yeah.
there's something in there, it's probably not as articulate as you, and thank you, this is really fascinating.
Oh, thank you. I'm really glad. I mean, you're touching on a kind of foundational question for Yiddish today, or Yiddish since the mid-20th century, right? Is that the community that has succeeded in using Yiddish as a vernacular are Hasidic and Haredi Jewish communities, in the US and in Israel and in a few other places. And it's really quite a different branch from the descendants of Yiddishism, right? So that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the whole kind of academic field of Yiddish descends from these Yiddish national cultural projects, right? Some that are associated with the Bund and its school system, some like the YIVO organization that, even though YIVO isn't socialist, it's very much a Yiddishist, meaning a cultural activist project. So that, and those movements are all largely secular defined. It's worth saying there that secular feels like a little bit of a mistranslation or like a false friend from the Yiddish concept, which is weltlich. So that means worldly. So the kind of Yiddish terms, right, that would separate Frumkeit or something and Weltlichkeit, right, like observance versus worldliness. And it does mean secular, but I think secular suggests to us strongly like opposed to religion, whereas Weltlich can mean a bit more like cultural or modern or something like that. So it's one of the, I guess I've heard it spoken about like, right, if we use the term secular, we're suddenly in the kind of realm of like Christian thought and not really coming from a kind of Jewish worldview place where, what does it really mean to separate out Jewish tradition from Yiddish culture? It's quite hard to do. And like most of the cultural producers of Yiddish in the 20th century are still very much coming from their traditional upbringings. That's the world that they come from. So like even when they are communists and rejecting everything about traditional observance, they've come from that life and that world in a way that's quite different from what we would think about it to be like religious or not religious today. So I think that's always one important point of like, to say that Yiddish culture is secular, like they wanted to see that they were moving away from religion and tradition and observance. But it's a bit inseparable from the language and culture. So I think Mark Kaplan has a nice phrase that Yiddish is always secularizing, but never secular, right? So really, yeah, that set of movements is one of the major organized ways that Yiddish has survived to today, through speakers to some degree, though a much smaller community of speakers than the Hasidic and Haredi communities, but very importantly through study, right? Like through the creation of archives and the creation of dictionaries and like our ability to kind of look back at these historical periods. It's all this one kind of trajectory. And the values of those movements are, as you say, like really quite different from the values of Hasidic and Haredi communities that still use Yiddish. So yeah, it is quite a fascinating topic that people write about from different angles, that how the kind of two major tendencies for whom Yiddish is important today are really quite divergent. And there are connections, right? There, especially the Yiddish academic world has realized that it's really been quite an oversight to kind of think that there's nothing important happening in Hasidic Yiddish. So like there's a lot of interesting Yiddish linguistic study today that's saying we have to get rid of these ideas that like this is not good Yiddish, and actually just see like what is the language doing and take it on its own terms and study it. So there's some more movement or connection, I think, now than what I remember like 20 years ago when I was starting out. But your observation is correct. It's quite noteworthy that there are these really two kind of divergent tendencies for the language. Yeah.
A follow-up question.
Well, I do want to make sure we've got
Okay,
time. Is that okay?
all right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not from the seminar.
Go for it.
But
I know.
yeah,
You want to introduce yourself?
I'm Sam Diaspora, and I wanted to ask, Vladimir Medem has this very specific conception of neutralism, and when I read like Esther Frumkin, or like, more modern like Roni Geckman talking about the debates within the Bund, it seems like there was still some disagreement where Medem was this leading theorist on the national question, but not all of his ideas were fully adopted. And I was kind of curious, like, what were the debates happening within the Bund about national cultural autonomy, about how autonomy should work?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And yeah, thank you for it. Because something I had in my notes and didn't get to say is the Bund is an interesting party in that it is not a fully centralized party. It's really not defined by its leaders. So Medem is kind of the best known and most prominent leader, but he was never in charge in any way, right? He's one person writing his theories and ideas and publishing them. And that was, respected and quite prominent, but really among a pretty large group of people who are articulating their ideas. And this is one of the things that I think that I admire in the Bund is like, there is not such a consistent, consolidated ideology. Like we see how much these ideas are changing through these decisions. And I think probably there is a kind of a lot of local autonomy among what different chapters are doing and what they're focusing on. So one could see that as a kind of embodiment of some of these ideas, right? That like, like he's saying, it depends where you are, like what the most important kind of political projects will be. And right, the decisions reflect actual debate within the party, and that debate is actually fostered, like they're a Democratic Party or something where people have different ideas, So that's one of the things that I find quite interesting, and certainly like in contrast to the Bolshevik Party, which the Bund is really fighting with throughout this whole early period, it's a clear kind of distinction. So I think you're right, and I think that's one of the things that is kind of noteworthy and worthy of study in this party, that it's not a party defined by a leader. It's not super coherent ideologically, but in ways that I read potentially as kind of productive examples of like, we actually we're not sure what's the solution here. So people keep sharing different ideas and trying them out in different ways. And so I think that would be defined, what you would do is you kind of look at the Bund in these different cities and see in places where like they focused on getting people elected to city council, or they focused on creating their school system, or they focused on their like tuberculosis sanatorium, or in this town, actually, they just really cared about their soccer team beating Maccabi, like probably in different places, different of those projects took precedence.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about how some of that tension shows up in the literature, because I think like reading that poem felt so nostalgic to the point that it undercuts the socialist message of the Bund. And I was also thinking, and I have to read all this stuff in translation, but like Ansky's work does seem I'm not exactly sure what his relation to the Bund was, but he was adjacent to it, right? It seems much compared to something like Abramovich's work, it doesn't seem to have that sort of like, look at how silly these Orthodox Jews are.
Yeah.
And the whole kind of idea of his ethnographic project, which is maybe based on some assumption that it's all going to go away when the revolution and we need to preserve it or something. But there seems to be like a really sophisticated nostalgia that with it, I don't know if danger is the right word. I assume that they would say danger, not just of turning into chauvinism, but of turning into like reaction, like cultural backwardsness or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation about this poem, right? That he is so, in this poem by Raisin is so invested in, it's an argument against the idea that Jews don't have a home in Europe. So it's absolutely engaging in a kind of only the good things about life here. And that's where it's helpful to remember, right, Raisin has left. He doesn't get to be home. He doesn't get to be fighting there anymore. So it does feel like it's engaging in the kind of nostalgia of immigrants, especially. So I think that is absolutely right in this poem, and something that we assume Raisin as a socialist more broadly wouldn't prescribe to, right, in other bits of his work. But Shin Ansky, who you bring up, I think is a great example of, he's doing everything, but in the literature that he's writing, he is both kind of raising up like Yiddish culture and folk tradition and exploring the kind of contemporary tensions of modernization and revolutionary thought. So if you haven't read his novellas, The Pioneers, there are two of them that are translated. Those are wonderful examples of like a literature that's really getting into the tensions of like young traditional Jews going to yeshiva and then realizing that everybody is actually reading like Russian socialist novels rather than studying Talmud or something. And they're like buying sausages to eat secretly together. So that's a wonderful literature of those tensions. I'll just mention, the novel that I've written about that is available in translation that I read is kind of getting into these debates is by Moshe Kulbach. It's called The Zelmanyaners. So that takes place in the early years of the Soviet Union. And it's about a kind of multi-generational Jewish family trying to figure out how to like get by in the new revolutionary state. So some people are like avid Bolsheviks and some people are like miss the way things were. And it kind of plays out those tensions. So that's available in English. So that's a great work to kind of see some of the ways that Yiddish writers are exploring these topics.
I want to be mindful of your time because I said we would end around 3:30. So join me in thanking Mindl. This has been Yeah, I feel like we're just scratching the surface here, but thank you so much. You've given us incredible launch pad for the rest of your lives here and beyond. Really appreciate you. Thanks for coming.
Great. Yeah, be in touch anytime if you have questions about the Yiddish Book Center. I was going to show a slide just to say, you know, check out the
I mean,
Yiddish
by
Book
all
Center.
means.
That's okay. No, I can just say it, but like, you know, if you haven't already or haven't recently, look up the Yiddish Book Center's website. We have tons of resources available. Look up in geveb. That's a wonderful place for contemporary study. And I was just going to say that, you know, the YIVO Encyclopedia is another kind of fabulous resource, kind of starting point for any of these questions that you have. So, but feel free to email me if there's any follow-up questions. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Mindl.
Bye. Bye. Seid gesund.
Be healthy. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. We're gonna take a 15-minute break now, so feel free to mingle. Those of you on Zoom in class, when we come back at, let's call it 3:50, we'll be in our normal class Zoom room, so just find us there at 3:50. And welcome and thanks for coming to those who joined us today.
Thank you so much for letting us come.
Yeah, great to have you.
One side.